Hello, welcome to the webinar on resident protections and engagement in RAD conversions of mod rehab and Section 202 PRACs. My name is Will Levy. I'm with the Office of Recapitalization here at HUD. I'm joined with my colleague Tai Alex, also from the Office of Recapitalization. The purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of resident rights and consultation requirements for the conversion of mod rehab SRO, and 202 PRAC properties. This webinar is primarily targeted for educating residents, resident advocates, and owners in these requirements. We're going to hold questions till the end, but folks should be aware that you can ask questions either by raising your hand through the module that shows up on your screen or by submitting written questions. You should also see that the handout, this presentation, is available through that same module. So if you want to follow along or keep notes or however you'd like to use that. Okay, let's get started. So before we dive into resident engagement and resident rights, I just want to first provide a brief background on RAD, why it was developed, what it is, and key principles in its design. So properties assisted with Section 8 moderate rehabilitation, or mod rehab, McKinney-Vento SRO, or single room occupancy, we call mod rehab SRO, and Section 202 project rental assistance contracts, or what we'll call 202 PRACs. These are aging stocks of HUD-assisted affordable housing that all renew on year-to-year rental assistance contracts. Because these contracts are year-to-year, it inhibits access to commonly used financing that's needed to make property improvements. Across the country, we have about 120,000 units of 202 PRACs that exclusively serve the elderly. We have 17,000 units of standard mod rehab that serves the general occupancy, low-income residents. And we have 13,500 units of mod rehab SRO, which specifically targets people exiting homelessness. So RAD was created in 2011 and since expanded and modified to preserve and bring new resources to these critical stocks of affordable housing by converting properties to subsidy under a long-term project-based Section 8 contract. This little diagram shows the different components of RAD. Folks should note we divide RAD into a first component and second component. The first component deals with public housing, whereas the second component deals with 202 PRACs, mod rehab SRO, and then the rent supplement and rental assistance payment contracts, the rent sup and RAP stocks, which are just about all converted. So this webinar doesn't cover them. RAD's implemented through a HUD notice, a joint housing and PIH notice, Housing Notice 2019-09 and PIH 2019-23. The RAD notice covers the conversion of all these affordable stocks to project-based rental assistance or project-based vouchers, which are two forms of long-term Section 8 contracts. When a property converts, it's no longer subject to the statute and regulations governing the program it's coming from, but as we'll describe in this webinar, the properties are subject to Section 8 requirements that ensure the property's ongoing affordability and that protect resident rights. This iteration of the RAD notice is actually the fourth iteration. This webinar will overview both pre-existing requirements plus any new requirements or protections that were implemented in the RAD notice dealing with resident issues. Property owners use RAD, or we expect they'll use RAD, to preserve affordable housing in their communities generally in one of three ways. One, they might have properties that are in pretty good shape but need a long-term contract to make sure that they remain affordable and have stable income. Two, owners may finance repairs leveraging the long-term Section 8 contract to finance any improvements. And three, owners may transfer the assistance to properties in lower poverty neighborhoods that either have greater access to schools, jobs, and transportation, or other community amenities. Once on the Section 8 platform, owners are better able to access other forms of financing to make property improvements. This includes debt, low-income housing tax credits, other grants or soft loans like home funds or other state and local funds, as well as existing property reserves. Generally, these are forms of financing that most other affordable housing owners and developers regularly access, but for which 202 PRACs and mod rehab properties have a hard time accessing. In addition to having a clear goal of facilitating property improvements, RAD was designed with core principles to guarantee broader public benefit, including long-term affordability, mission-based stewardship, and ensuring resident rights. With respect to long-term preservation and affordability, before any property converts, we require a capital needs assessment to be performed upfront to ensure that the owner can address the current and future repairs that the property needs. Once converted, the property goes under a long-term Section 8 HAB contract, which provides stable subsidy to the property and ensures that tenants pay an affordable rent. Not applicable to mod rehab conversions, but specific to 202 PRACs. 202 PRACs we also record a RAD elderly housing use agreement on the land, which extends the required affordability of the property 20 years beyond which their current use agreement would normally go. Further, during the term of that use agreement for the 202 PRACs, the HAP must be renewed. 202 PRACs also have a requirement of a one-for-one replacement of deeply affordable units, with certain minor exceptions. Next core principle is we carry over existing ownership requirements. So 202 PRACs are currently owned by nonprofits, and that's our expectation going forward, that once they're on the Section 8 platform, the property must continue to be owned or controlled by a nonprofit owner, including when tax credits are used. Typically, the nonprofit will need to retain control of the property. There's no similar restrictions for mod rehab properties converting under RAD because those properties currently today do not have any restrictions on ownership types. The next core principle, we maintain the occupancy requirements of the property. So 202 PRAC conversions, once they convert to Section 8, will continue to serve the elderly. Mod rehab SRO conversions will continue to serve formerly homeless. And the regular mod rehab will continue to be general occupancy properties. Fourth core principle is that we want to ensure that current residents benefit from the conversion. So to that end, we want to make sure residents are informed of the conversion through meetings and notices. All residents have a right to remain in, or if there's any rehab at the site and they need to be temporarily relocated, to return to the property. Residents cannot be rescreened as a result of RAD, even though there'll be a new admission into the Section 8 programs. They cannot be screened for admission into Section 8, as we'll discuss later. And residents are eligible for relocation assistance. We'll go through each of these in greater detail a little bit later in the presentation. Let's now provide an overview of the steps an owner needs to take to convert a property through RAD, with a special emphasis on resident engagement and related items. So this slide reflects the major milestones in a RAD conversion. An owner begins the process by giving HUD a submission of interest, which provides just some basic information. At that point, the owner will begin to provide notices to residents and hold resident meetings, as well as work on developing its conversion plan, which could take 6 to 18 months to develop and submit a conversion plan that fully describes what they're planning to do at the site. Typically, HUD will take 60 to 90 days to review and approve or require changes to the conversion plan. And once that approval is given, the owner will typically take 60 to 90 days to complete the conversion. Once converted, any work that may be required at the property would begin. So far, over 5,500 mod rehab and SRO units have completed this entire process. On the 202 PRAC side, since we've only recently published the conversion requirements, no 202 PRACs have yet completed the conversion process. So just to go into a little bit more detail on each of these steps, at the initial step, the submission of interest, the owner provides basic property and contract information. HUD assigns a transaction manager to provide technical assistance to the owner. And then the owner begins to identify the necessary scope of work that the site needs, to find partners if needed, and to secure any financing commitments. The next step, after the submission of interest, the owners provide written notification letters to all residents. We have samples available on radresource.net, both for mod rehab and for 202 PRACs, and if they're not there yet, they will be available soon. Owners must conduct at least 2 resident meetings to describe conversion plans. In some cases, owners might be meeting with residents more frequently if the conversion involves more complicated plans. Any comments that the owner receives during these meetings or in this process must be submitted with the conversion plan, as well as the owner's response to the comments. During this period, owners will typically also be working with residents that may need to be temporarily relocated. Such discussions will generally be on an individual basis and not necessarily in a community meeting setting. When the owner is ready, it will then submit to HUD a conversion plan, which includes the capital needs assessment, environmental review materials, the proposed financing, description of relocation, and a number of other materials, including, as discussed, the comments from the residents. After HUD's reviewed that conversion plan, we provide an approval letter, which will outline the key components of the plan conversion and the conditions that need to be satisfied before we're willing to close the conversion. At closing, once the owner completes all those closing requirements, it gets to closing. At closing, we cancel a prior contract that the contract is currently under and remove any pre-existing use agreements, and then enter into a new Section 8 HAB contract. And for the 202 PRACs, we record a RAD elderly housing use agreement at the site. Residents will sign new Section 8 leases at that point, and no tenant, as described earlier and go into greater detail later, no tenant would be rescreened, so there's no need for a new tenant certification at that time. At this stage, if required by HUD's approval letter, rehab or construction would begin. Residents, therefore, may be moved temporarily to accommodate the rehab or construction, but then would return following the completion of that rehab or construction. Okay, now that I've provided this background, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Faye Alex, to walk through the resident rights in mod rehab and 202 PRAC conversions.
Great, thank you, Will. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining this webinar, and thanks to Will for that great overview. As Will mentioned, this portion of the webinar will focus on the individual resident rights included in the RAD notice, which apply to residents living in mod rehab and 202 PRAC housing. Many of the resident rights applicable to public housing residents are similar, though there are some distinctions. Resident rights are very important in the RAD process and are designed to maintain and expand on existing rights. All residents should be informed about what their rights are, and all owners and property managers involved in RAD should stay in regular communication with residents about the process. Tenant rents. Resident rents remain affordable after conversion. In Section 8, residents pay 30% of their adjusted gross income. In other words, resident rent should not change as a result of the conversion. Right to remain and right of return. Most conversions do not involve relocation, which means that residents will remain in their homes. However, if it is necessary, some of the most essential resident rights in RAD are the right to remain and the right of return. The notice states that any person who is legally on the lease or otherwise in lawful occupancy at the converting property has a right to remain in, or if there will be rehab of the property that will result in the relocation of residents, a right to return to an assisted unit at the property. A resident will return to an affordable, correctly sized unit, but it may not be the unit in which they lived previously. Just to reiterate, no resident may be permanently involuntarily displaced. No rescreening. Residents cannot be rescreened following a RAD conversion. This includes screening for income, criminal background, and credit. After the conversion, residents will be covered by all Section 8 residency requirements. It's very important to note that a conversion under RAD cannot be the basis for an eviction or loss of rental assistance. Relocation. As previously mentioned, relocation in RAD conversions is not common. However, it may be necessary so that repairs can be completed at the project. Some things to remember. The relocation should not begin until HUD approves the conversion plan. Before an owner can proceed with relocation plans, they should provide a general information or GIN, general information notice or GIN, that includes an overview of resident rights under the RAD notice and URA and information regarding a resident's right to return, relocation assistance, and displacement. If the resident will be relocated, they need to be provided with proper notice, and their temporary housing must be affordable, decent, safe, and sanitary. Residents must also be reimbursed for out-of-pocket expenses incurred during the relocation. If the relocation extends beyond 12 months, the resident is considered displaced for the purposes of URA protection, and the RAD protections continue to apply as well. We also encourage owners to maintain a resident log for all impacted residents to be provided to HUD upon request, and this information should be as detailed as possible. Alternative housing options. While residents have the right to return to a converted property post-rehab, owners may also offer alternative housing options, such as vouchers, other converted RAD properties, homeownership opportunities, and so on. These options would ensure that the resident remains in affordable housing that's best suited for their household. However, if residents voluntarily decline their right to return, the owner must obtain written consent, which is 1, informed through written notification and the provision of counseling, 2, voluntary, which requires that the resident is not pressured to make a decision and has at least 30 days to do so, and 3, that it is documented. So this means that the owner must retain evidence that the resident was informed in writing, received counseling, and communicated their final decision. Right of return and low-income housing tax credits. As Will described earlier, one of the funding sources used by owners to support rehab or construction costs is the low-income housing tax credit program. While this program has different income requirements than Section 8, residents cannot be barred from returning to the property following a conversion. Residents residing in properties that receive low-income tax credits will be screened for eligibility during the RAD conversion process, but this will not impact their right to return or their eligibility to reside in affordable housing. Income eligibility for LAHTC is generally 60% of area median income, though it can be higher for states that have adopted what is known as income averaging, which allows some residents to have higher incomes if, on the whole, the property is serving very low-income households. Resident procedural rights. Resident procedural rights are governed by the RAD notice, and in the case of multifamily Section 8 properties, 24 CFR Part 245. They include a resident's right to organize, form resident organizations, canvass, meet on the property, and access to grievance and termination procedures. In order to be considered a resident organization, it must be established by the residents of the property, meet regularly, operate democratically, and represent all residents at the property. Choice mobility. Prior to closing, the owner should inform residents about the choice mobility option, and it needs to be included in the lease. Residents in PBV properties may request a housing choice voucher after 1 year of residency at the converted property. Just a few reminders for residents. It's important to always check notices for information about the RAD process. Attend all resident meetings when possible, and if not possible, find time to meet with the property manager when you are able to obtain all information presented at the meeting. Ask questions and be proactive in getting information, and request clarification if needed before signing anything. Residents may have questions come up along the way, and periodically issues may also arise. If that happens, the best thing to do is start with your property manager. If the property has not yet converted and you need further assistance, please contact the HUD Multifamily Field Office. Following conversion, confirm whether the property has converted to either PBRA or PBB. If PBRA, contact the Multifamily Regional Office, and if it's PBB, contact the HUD Public Housing Field Office. We've provided links on this slide to obtain that contact information. When you contact HUD, remember to include all information you have about the property, like the property name, location, name of the owner, the conversion type, the stage in the RAD process, and your questions or concerns.
Thank you very much, Tayi, for that outline. So I think we're going to go to questions now. And while people are putting their questions together and submitting them, just to point you to other resources on hud.gov/rad, we have a resident information drop-down with some really helpful fact sheets for mod rehab residents, and soon we'll have a similar fact sheet for PRAC residents. You can always contact rad2@hud.gov with questions, regardless of who you are. We'll get those questions directed to the appropriate party and respond to you. We also encourage you to join the RAD listserv just so you are aware of updates on RAD and periodic news that we might send out. If you just search for HUD listservs and find the page for RAD, it's very easy to sign up for. So with that, let's see what we've got in terms of questions. So one question we received so far is what kinds of 202 PRACs make the most sense to convert? So we think generally the conversion to RAD will be attractive to a broad swath of owners. You're interested in stabilizing their income, being under the Section 8 umbrella. But it makes particular sense for properties that are starting to age and have some backlogged capital repairs that they can't necessarily fund readily out of their PRAC budget. Some major capital expenses where it makes sense to take out new financing. And the RAD conversion helps to facilitate the upfront financing of capital repairs rather than addressing them through drips and drabs from replacement reserve expenses. So there's another question, how long the conversion process will take. So it will vary significantly particularly by the capital needs of the property and the financing needed. So it's possible for a conversion from start to finish to take 6 months if the conversion and financing are fairly straightforward. But if the owner is trying to secure tax credits and needs to wait for application rounds, that could take longer. That could take over a year. Could take a year and a half or so, depending on the timing there. It's largely going to be driven by the needs of the property and the complexity of the financing that the owner is seeking to address those needs. So there's a question about whether properties that convert under to project-based vouchers, which are under a PHA's Housing Choice Voucher Program, whether an oral briefing is required prior to admission. Yes, that all residents upon admission to a project-based voucher program would need to receive an oral briefing notifying them of their resident rights under the voucher program and obligations. Okay, there's a question on choice mobility. So when properties convert to project-based vouchers, part of that program is the residents have an option to move with a tenant-based voucher that comes out of the PHA's voucher turnover. So when the resident is given a voucher, does the project-based voucher contract stay intact on the unit the resident is leaving? The answer is yes, that if the resident chooses to leave with a tenant-based voucher, it does not affect the assistance of the property. The owner would then just lease to the next next on the waiting list to lease that unit. And the voucher doesn't come from that unit, but comes from the PHA's existing inventory of vouchers and what turns over there. Here's a good question about whether it's required for HUD staff to participate in the resident meetings. It's not required for HUD staff to participate in those resident meetings. So there's a question about whether RAD can be used to develop in conjunction with new construction on adjacent lots, or possibly. I think it sounds like a deal-specific question. We'd suggest, if you haven't reached out to us already to talk it through with a transaction manager, shoot us a note, either give us a submission of interest or send us a note at rad2@hud.gov, and we can set up a time to talk with you about the specific vision you have. Okay, so there's a question about real estate taxes and whether transitioning a property, I'm going to assume this is in the context of a 202 PRAC where they're nonprofit owned and typically may have a state or local property tax exemption. Nothing in the conversion changes or requires the ownership to change. So if the property converts from a PRAC contract to a Section 8 contract, the nonprofit will continue to own the property, and so you should talk with local tax counsel, but there, on the face of it, there doesn't appear to be any reason why the conversion itself may cause a change in tax liability. Now, using low-income housing tax credits, you may be transferring the property into what is technically a for-profit partnership. And where it might get more complicated, more dependent on state and local determinations. So our advice is to check with local tax counsel. So there's a question about environmental reviews and how those are to be completed. Typically, owners will hire a consultant to complete the phase one, and if necessary, further phases of the environmental review. That's not something owners are typically capable of doing within house. There's a question about the submission of interest and how soon after the submission of interest does HUD try to get in contact with the owner and assign a transaction manager. Typically, that'll occur within a couple of weeks, if not sooner. As we've discussed in prior webinars, a submission of interest is not a commitment in any way on the owner's part. It really just is it engages you with HUD staff that you can call on for assistance. Got a great question about whether this webinar is recorded and whether it will be available. Yes, it will be available, like all of our recordings, on the resource desk. If you are signed up for our listserv, we will even let you know when it has been posted. We will soon announce that all the webinars that we posted the last 5 weeks on the revision for the RAD notice and on resident rights will, most of them are already posted on the resource desk, and this one will join shortly once we complete this webinar. So we have a few more questions here, but they're more transaction related and less about resident rights and engagement. So we will follow up with those afterwards separately, just so that this folks listening to this recording in the future only have kind of focused questions on resident issues. But we will get back to you. If you've not already listened to our overview of PRAC conversions, that is already available on the RAD resource desk. At radresource.net. But if there are no more questions related to resident rights, we will wrap up. There's a question about the resident comment process. Was described earlier. Owners are required to provide residents with notices and solicit comments from residents. And there's a question on how will HUD take into consideration those comments and the owner's response. So primarily our review of those comments will be to assess that there has been good communication with residents to confirm that generally speaking, owners are being responsive to residents, and to check if there are any issues that rise to program compliance concerns in those interactions. So resident consent or kind of sign-off is not required as part of the conversion process. Okay, so with that, thank you all for joining. As mentioned, this will be recorded and posted to the resource desk. We appreciate your participation and your questions. Have a very nice day.